listening to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and more. Here's your host, KickedTripod.
Good morning, Overwatch League fans. This is your Overwatch League daily episode for January 19th, 2018. Today, I'm joined by Overwatch Pacific Championship caster and analyst for Full Circle, Kevin AVRL Walker, to discuss last night's matches. Last night we saw the beginning of week 2 of the inaugural season. While last week was filled with hype and excitement, we're really hoping to see teams settle down and find their groove for the long road of matches ahead. In the first match of the evening, we saw two teams that are kind of difficult to peg in the Overwatch League landscape. The Philadelphia Fusion showed us glimpses of brilliance as they took a surprising victory over the Outlaws last week, before getting swept by the Spitfire 4-0. The Shock, on the other hand, were swept by the Valiant before defeating the Dragons 3-1. While it is only been a week, these varied and inconsistent results have made it kind of difficult to evaluate these teams overall. The big picture became a bit clearer last night as the Shock and Fusion squared off in what was likely to be the only close match of the evening. We started off on Dorado, where both teams struggled to put together an effective offense. The Shock were held just shy of point B, but thanks to some heroics from Baby Bay, the Fusion were held to just 1 point. The Shock take map 1 in a surprising 2-1 victory. Next, we went to Temple of Anubis. Again, this map would be decided by defenses, as the Shock were held to just 1 point on their offensive push. While the Fusion stumbled on their point A offense, they forced a capture with just over a minute and a half to spare. That would be all the momentum the Fusion would need, as they would soon capture point B with 3 minutes in the bank on the back of a 16-kill streak by Shadowburn's Genji. On Oasis, the Shock put up a fight, but ultimately the Fusion would prevail 2-1 here. And for map 4, we went to Eichenwald. Both teams would be able to finish the map, though the Shock finished in overtime. Philadelphia had just 2 minutes to take one tick off of point A to win the series 3-1. However, Nevix, Nomi, and Dante came up big, and Eichenwald would end in a draw. The Fusion barely walk away from this one on top, 2-1. AVRL, first of all, thanks again for coming back on the show. What I want to do is talk to you a little bit about that first map on Dorado for the Shock. We saw the Shock run Dante on Junkrat and Baby Bay on McCree, and with that composition, they were able to full hold the Fusion. Why were the Shock so successful here?
One of the primary questions I had in the back of my mind coming into this series was, how does Shock deal with a good dive team like Fusion? Because what you can definitely say about these two teams, which is then further evidenced by today's results, is that Shock are not as good of a dive team as Fusion, and not only that, but you could probably stretch it further to say Shock isn't even as good of an attacking team as Fusion in general. So, with those two things considered, that means Shock's real win condition here has to fall on their defense. Baby Bay played McCree and Widow throughout the entire series. Dante swapped around between either Tracer or Junkrat, but at all times, it was pretty clear that Shock's game plan was to utilize their backline peel with both the McCree and or Junkrat to punish aggressive divers from Fusion and hopefully bait them into overcommitting. Now, that strategy only got them so far on attack, and definitely got visibly weaker when Baby Bay switched to the Widow, which, while giving them more vertical pressure, severely limited their team's ability to actually punish their dive. And I think if they continued to play a disengaged backline-centric comp while still using their Winston and Diva to pressure the high ground instead of the Widowmaker, they would have had much better success on that attack instead of banking everything on Baby Bay to make plays as the Widowmaker. When you look at Shock's A-hold, though, that's when the backline defense was really solid. It was so hard for Fusion to break Shock's backline when you have both a McCree and a Junkrat who both have huge damage output and can both peel. That's like a Genji's nightmare to dive into. And Shock's positioning was also so well played that they knew how much space they had to work with, and they continued back up until they knew Fusion was spread too thin. Meanwhile, as the Fusion frontline are flying away, there's still a poor Fusion backline trying to push the cart, which the tanks of Shock readily put a stop to. And something you'll learn about dive very quickly is that the viable range of a dive is only as far as what the entire team can feasibly work with, which is to say, if certain members can't keep up with the dive, namely as Zenyatta in this case, then the dive has overcommitted beyond their support's line of sight and effective engagement range, and they've spread themselves too thin. So it's something Shock gladly took advantage of, and, you know, at the end of the day, it's textbook disengage into counter dive punish, executed extremely well from Shock that got them a win on Dorado.
So talking about the Fusion, you kind of mentioned the dive comp a little bit, but what makes the Fusion so good on control and assault maps versus those payload and hybrid maps?
I actually don't see any overbearing problems for Fusion's escort game mode compared to, say, any of the other game modes. If you look at their Stage 1 record so far, they've beaten Houston on Dorado on their way to winning that match. They lost to Junkertown to London, but of the 4 maps they played against London, that was the only one they scored on. Then just most recently, last night, they lost Dorado to Shock. That's not actually a bad record, all things considered, and I'd say it's definitely not conclusive on either their success or lack of success on Escort so far. If I was to speculate on what might affect Fusion as a team for this game mode, I'd say that the actual card objective is probably counterproductive to Fusion's playstyle as a team. So remember that Fusion is a fast, aggressive dive team that really shines with huge mechanical output on both Genji and Tracer. On the other game modes, they're sort of unleashed to play the game at whatever pace they want, which is one of their biggest strengths as a team. But when you get to Escort, the actual payload itself puts a sort of artificial cap on your pace as an attacking team. So if you win a team fight on Escort, you can't just snowball onto the next objective like Assault. One of the hallmarks of Fusion, as shown in last night's series, was their ability to be consistently proactive in finding the initiative to make dives happen. That's the sign of a good dive team when compared to a team like Shock, who are far too passive and indecisive to find the same dive windows that Fusion do. On top of that, you've got incredible mechanics coming out of both Carpe and Shadowburn, with pre-pack synergy built during their time together on FaZe. Top that off with tank coordination coming out of Fraggy and Poco, and suddenly you've got a really scary front line that can often outvalue trades even if they lose their own backline, which so far hasn't needed to happen too often because Boombox and Neptuno have been really good at staying alive. At the end of the day, though, it's the speed and decisiveness which is why Assault and Control are especially well suited to Fusion's playstyle. They don't need to wait for objectives here. They can make plays happen in their own time, and they can outpace slower teams easily and leave them in the dust.
So ultimately, this match was relatively close, and I think some people thought it would be. I also think there's a lot of people who didn't think it would be very close. At the end of the day, was this a strong performance for the Shock? Was this an underperformance from the Fusion, or some other combination of factors?
I think both teams really showed their strengths and weaknesses last night, and it was probably more telling of Shock as a team than Fusion, but I don't necessarily think it was a close series at all, and certainly don't think Shock performed well or Fusion performed badly. A couple of the big problems for Shock still come down to an over-reliance on Baby Bay to make plays on Widowmaker, and that's the difference between teams like Shock and Dynasty, because even when Fledder misses shots, which he missed plenty of last night, Seoul can still reliably win engagements and pull results. That's something that Shock hasn't been able to do when Baby Bay isn't on point. And the second issue is Dak being outvalued on Mercy and being picked off in really inopportune times for his team. The classic example being City Center, where Dak pulled the trigger way too early on his Valkyrie to then just get heavily outvalued by Neptuno's Valkyrie a second later. So the overarching theme for me during the series was, how does Shock avoid getting run over against the speed of Fusion? And that's kind of what it felt like even when Shock were winning. They were kind of balancing on a knife's edge, and at any point you could expect Fusion to break through. So what I do think Shock did well was their ability to read Fusion's compositions and understand what adjustments they need to make to find a win condition. That's why they ran such a peel-focused comp on Dorado, which won them that map. That's why they rolled out of City Center with McCree to directly challenge Shadowburn's Pharah. That gave them, that first fight win, forcing Shadowburn to make a respect change on the Genji, giving Shock a huge leg up on that map as well. Counter-drafting, unfortunately, only got Shock so far because it was extremely evident that as soon as they tried to play dive themselves on Anubis or tried to play a mirror match in terms of composition against Fusion on Gardens and University, they got horribly outmatched, especially in the Pharah versus Pharah duel. Now, Fusion, on the other hand, looked pretty comfortable outside of their Dorado blunder, but that was still a Fusion-dominated defense, which really exposed Shock's deficiency in their attack strategy. That's compounded by the fact that Shock didn't finish either Dorado or Anubis and only finished Eichenwald in the overtime, which was 2 minutes slower than Fusion. So again, the theme of the match was Fusion's attack versus Shock's defense, because it was ultimately that defense that won them Dorado and forced a draw on Eichenwald.
For the second match of the evening, we saw the Seoul Dynasty, who have yet to lose in the Overwatch League preseason or regular season, take on the Florida Mayhem, who have yet to find a win in the same span of time. Needless to say, the bar was set pretty low for the Mayhem going into this one, but fans were hoping for a sign of life from the Finns and Swedes. Seoul would make a few changes to their lineup, bringing in Guido on support with Jaehong, Kuki taking Miro's Winston spot, and Zephyr filling in for Zumba's Diva. This one was going to go the way of Seoul 4 maps to 0, but there were some bright spots. Tvik showed some life and leadership, and Logix put up some respectable numbers. Each round it felt as if the Mayhem were just a few kills and a few fights away from a different outcome. However, the Mayhem would still be unable to finish a map and would lose both rounds on Oasis. So AVRL, let's discuss Dorado and Horizon Lunar Colony. They were both close losses for the Mayhem. What made it so close? And more importantly, why weren't they able to close it out?
I'll speak to Dorado first, and I don't want to make any excuses for Seoul, but let's take into account anyway that Seoul were not running their starting lineup. I know that's not super valid, and if Mayhem won, they would have still deserved that victory, and Seoul would have still deserved that loss. But that's also kind of the point as well, because Mayhem didn't beat Seoul's B lineup. That was Guido's first game, you got Jaehong on Mercy. This is about the best chance you've got against Seoul. Something I've also noticed about the Dynasty at a more meta level beyond the game is their approach to how they handle a series in general. If you go back and look at their results, you'll notice that a good chunk of the maps they've lost have been on the first map. Junkertown memes aside, even when they did win that first map, it's usually one of the closer maps in the series. Now, Seoul as a team really take a patient approach early on to feel their opponents out, and you can see them giving a lot more respect to the other team early on in the series, and then much less respect towards the end of the series. You can even check back at the old Lunatic High results in Apex and Seoul Cup. If they lose a map, it's typically within the first 2, and then they usually come back swinging more and more convincingly until they close out a series or, drop it entirely to GC Busan. Seoul generally use the early maps in the series to kind of figure their opposition out, making an assessment on their playstyles, strengths and weaknesses, and then adapting throughout the series to exploit any holes they find. Now, looking at Mayhem, they typically have some similar issues to San Francisco, except instead of Baby Bay, this time it's Tvik that carries a lot of the weight for his team. When Mayhem are winning, Tvik is getting a lot of kills. When Mayhem are losing, Tvik's getting shut down. And just like in Shock, that says a lot more about the surrounding 5 members than it does about the player expected to carry. That was pretty obvious on Dorado. As soon as Fleta switched to Widow, Tvik spent most of his time looking for Fleta, and the rest of Mayhem spent most of their time waiting for Tvik. So no surprises as to why they didn't finish that map. Florida generally had the most success when they did something to surprise Seoul, so they were honestly in a great position to snowball their attack on Horizon off the opening Sombra play between Tvik and Logix. Zebasai even got a headshot on Toby on the B attack, and then Tvik just needed to camp him and spawn with the EMP to prevent Toby's Valkyrie. But after failing that play, they couldn't close out their attack at all once Seoul stabilized and dug in their heels. Even then, unfortunately, a part of me also does have to wonder, if Mayhem completed that attack with a huge time bank remaining, could they have won the whole map? Because it was pretty clear that no matter how much time they had, they couldn't break Seoul's B defense, which means even if we went to time bank, I just don't see Mayhem finishing that map.
At the end of it all, I don't think the final score of 4-0 is really that surprising. However, I think it is interesting to see how close some of these maps were. With their performance against Seoul, do you think the Mayhem are finally trending up?
Mayhem obviously still have some ways to go, and I'm not going to beat a dead horse by talking about the size of their roster. They've made it very clear that at least for now, they're not seeing it as an issue, and at least for Stage 1, it's not something that can be addressed anyway. A nearly dead horse that I will beat, however, is they're one of the teams that have had the most trouble adapting to the current Mercy meta. If you're expecting me to say here that Zebasai is a bad Mercy, you're wrong. He's a bad Mercy, and also Mayhem haven't adapted to the playstyle that really utilizes Mercy well. This is kind of why roster size isn't a huge deal for this team right now. Subbing in another player doesn't magically fix playstyle issues. Swapping out a Mayhem member for Fleta won't suddenly win them games. Swapping out all of Mayhem's roster for 6 Fletas might though, But all jokes aside, look, it's very concerning that a team coming into the league with as much history and past dominance in their regional scene is currently doing this poorly. Between the preseason and Stage 1, their map record is 3-17, and their 0-4 loss against Boston is probably the most eye-opening of the matches they've lost. The good for Mayhem right now, though, is despite how few and far between their moments are, they're still very capable of some really big plays. The Horizon opening versus Seoul last night being a good example of one. This is a team that, when allowed to be proactive, they can really do some work. They've looked their best versus Seoul when they're playing fast and aggressive with dive, forcing Seoul to be the ones adapting to keep up with their pace instead of the other way around. And hey, at the end of the day, Florida is still going to beat Shanghai on Friday, so they'll definitely break their losing streak.
Speaking of winless teams, the Houston Outlaws and the Shanghai Dragons both have yet to put up a point in the win column despite having very different stories of how they got there. The Outlaws have faced what is arguably four of the top teams in the Overwatch League: the Dynasty, Fuel, NYXL, and Fusion. In today's post-match interview, Jae Hong had mentioned that he felt Houston was really good. On the other side, you have the Shanghai Dragons, who have only seemed to have gotten worse since their preseason debut. In the preseason, we saw some exciting performances from Dia that perhaps made it look like Shanghai wouldn't be competing for the very bottom of the league. However, since the preseason, Shanghai has taken only one map between their first two matches. At the end of the day, the Outlaws needed a boost, and Shanghai needed to show they could compete. We saw arguably the worst performance from Shanghai we have seen since the Overwatch League began, as the Dragons would only capture 2 points throughout the entire series. In the end, it would be the Outlaws who take the series with ease 4 maps to 0. While Houston will finally get a notch in their win column, Shanghai continues to tread at the bottom of the Pacific Division with 0 wins and 3 losses. I don't want to beat around the bush with this one. This was one of the most one-sided matches we've seen yet in Overwatch League. Does Shanghai have what it takes to compete in this league?
This one's a real heartbreaker. The first team in terms of brand announced for the Overwatch League, the worst team in the league by far. And they actually had a good start with a promising display versus Seoul in the preseason. In all fairness, I'll also give Houston a lot of credit here because both teams came in without any wins, and you could tell the Outlaws were hungry to get one on the leaderboard finally. And believe it or not, it's technically not even the most one-sided match we've seen in the season. Gladiators beat Shanghai even worse in Week 1. Dragons managed to get 2 points in the match last night. They only got a 1 against LA in their first week. I said just before as well that Florida are going to beat Shanghai on Friday, and I still hold that to be true. At least Florida has some existing synergy from Misfits. Shanghai doesn't even have that. Their loss against Houston included being spawn camped on more than one map. They still have major underlying issues surrounding their tanks and supports. I haven't even gone up to addressing the DPS yet because they still haven't even found an identity for Dia yet. What is even his role on the team right now? In the preseason, he showed off a sick Widow against Seoul and looked like he was going to be a star hit scan player, but now he's playing Junkrat and Undead is on the Widow instead. I'm also beginning to think that Undead is becoming a liability on this team because nothing he's played so far has really been outstanding, and he was one of the big names upon originally joining the roster when announced. He's forced Dia off his best picks now, and isn't performing on the heroes that he's taken off Dia. If anything, this roster should be played around Dia right now with Undead permanently on Tracer, and Dia as the anchor flex DPS, playing the hit scans between McCree and Widow. If they want to, they can also absolutely run the same positions as San Fran Shock. That would actually be a huge upgrade for them right now. I guess that's a silver lining, though, because they've now hit a low enough point that the only direction they can realistically go is up. I will also give credit to their tenacity for being willing to scrim 11-hour days and to keep their chins up throughout all the losses. All we can do now is hope that some of those results start to come through out of those 11-hour days, because it's really disheartening to see a team do this badly. But I also know that no one feels as disappointed as they do, which means they won't stop trying, and at least no one can take that away from them.
My thanks to AVRL for joining me on the show today. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at I'mAVRL. That's I'mAVRL. Tomorrow we have the Fuel taking on the Outlaws at 2 p.m. Pacific, the Excelsior taking on the Valiant at 4 p.m. Pacific, and the Fusion taking on the Gladiators at 6 p.m. Pacific. I'll be joined by Seamoose tomorrow morning to discuss this evening's matches. One other thing I wanted to bring up, and I'm not going to bring it up often, but people have asked, and we actually have launched a Patreon for this show. If you head on over to patreon.com/OWL Daily Show, you can get all of the info there. If you like the show, you like all the content, we've got just over 30 episodes in 45 days. So if you like that and want to support the content itself and help support us make an awesome show, by all means, go ahead and check that out there. There's no perks, there's no goals. It's just there if you feel like it's something that you want to contribute to. And I promise I won't bring it up very often. Remember, you can find the show on all of your favorite podcast outlets, including iTunes, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, and Google Podcasts. And of course, we are on the front page of winstonslab.com as well. We're also on YouTube. Click on the link in the show notes to find us. And if you want to stay in touch, email me at overwatchleaguedaily@gmail.com, tweet me at OWL Daily Show, or join our Discord at discord.me/OWL Daily Show. Of course, you can find everything on our website at overwatchleaguedaily.com. With that, that's going to be it for this episode. We'll be back tomorrow for another one with Seamoose.